it's Olivia here again. Once again, I'm just repurposing and being smart about how I'm doing this. So I'm live on Instagram, I'm live on Facebook, and I'm also recording this for video purposing for YouTube and my podcast. So I'm all about, trying to make the most of your time and maximizing your time and having like a streamlined process so that your content can be as many places as possible and reach as many people as possible as well. So if I'm looking all over the place, this is why. And I thought I'd just try a different background today because I just like standing and talking as opposed to like sitting over a microphone on my desk. So I thought, hey, let's just switch it up a little bit. So firstly, welcome. I'm Olivia. I have a podcast. I'm a podcast host. I'm a podcast junkie. I love podcasting. I love doing it. I love listening to podcasts. I'm all about podcasting, but there's a lot more to me than just that. But we're talking about podcasting at the moment. So firstly, one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of podcasters, they start a podcast and they start off really strong and they know exactly what they want to talk about. And then what tends to happen after a while is that they, talk about everything they wanted to talk about. And after a couple of episodes, they're like, oh crap, I've got nothing else. I'm struggling for ideas. I'm scratching my head on what to talk about on my podcast. And I've gone to all the trouble of starting one, but like what now? And this was me back in 2018. I did about 6 episodes or something. And by that point, I was like, cool, I've shared my story. I've said what I needed to say. What do I want to talk about now? There's so much, but I don't know what I specifically, what's aligned to my message and what my people want to hear and all this sort of stuff. So I was kind of going through this period of like, I got at what I immediately wanted to. And then I kind of hit a bit of a creative block. And I was like, oh, okay, what do I talk about now? Do you know what I mean? So what I want to talk about on this particular video, podcast, Facebook Live, Instagram Live, or whatever, was basically how to help your listeners fall in love at first listen, but then also to continue showing up to your podcast and listening to the episodes, not just listening for the first couple of episodes and then dropping off and never, hearing from you again, basically. So falling in love at first listen is super duper important. And this is why I always suggest that people, when they launch their podcast, to submit it to iTunes, you at least need 1 episode. And with that, I ideally recommend having an intro and an outro. So if you think about a structure of an episode, if you guys listen to podcasts, you know what I'm talking about. You've got the intro, which is like telling your audience who you are, what this podcast is about, basically setting up the expectations of what they're going to hear from you. And then you've got the actual content, which is the juicy stuff. This is the stuff that changes every episode because it's like the content of an essay, but in audio format, if that makes sense. And then the outro is the bit at the end. And this is super important as well because it actually directs your audience to continue on with you in some capacity and to continue that relationship with you, whether that be to go, and we call them call to actions, so CTAs, and that's why I always recommend having them in the actual outro, as well as thanking the audience for actually rocking up and listening to your episode as well, right? Because it's so important to be thankful and grateful for that and show that appreciation to your people. Yeah, so always have that in there. That's what I recommend. You don't have to, of course. And then also have a call to action or a couple of call to actions, but not too many. So that call to action could be anything ranging from, hey, go check out my website or leave a review or join my Facebook group or check out my LinkedIn account or see you in the next episode or recommend this to a friend. Or I had a friend that recently started a podcast and she asked her audience to take a snapshot of the screen and share it on Instagram because that's where she's building her following. And that worked beautifully because when she launched, she had all of these people sharing their snapshot and messages, and she got to repurpose that to her audience. So it actually showed her audience that there was, already parts of her audience that were already listening, which is great. Hang on, sorry guys. Don't mind my messy background. So she already had an audience and a following on Instagram. She started a podcast and they all jumped over to listen to her podcast, and she's nearly reached 1,000 downloads in under technically like a week. So that's amazing statistics, right? For when you first launch and start, which is great. So that was a great call to action. So you've got to think about what's actually suitable for you, right? And what your mission and purpose is with your podcast, as well as maybe your business if you have one with your podcast. So it's really important to get clear on that. And these are the sort of things I can help you with in my program, Podcast Launch Queens, if you're not actually sure. So what I wanted to talk about was, and by the way, if you haven't listened to episode 41 of Become a Podcast Queen, which is my podcast, feel free to check that out because I just interviewed this amazing, incredible lady called Mariah, and she calls herself the Content Queen. And I tell you what, she knows what she's talking about. And that's a really great episode because we're going to so much around content for your podcast, and it's all free, valuable information. And it's going to be a little bit different than what I talk about on here. So firstly, content. right? So when it comes to creating content, some people can get a bit of a block. They struggle a little bit because they're like, I don't know what to talk about anymore or what to come up with next. What do I talk about on my podcast? Once again, it all really comes back down to your niche and your ideal listener, which I've already talked about if you go back to another Facebook Live, IGTV, and all these things, right? So if you haven't watched that yet, I encourage you to watch that first and then come back to this, or finish this first and then go to that. And so it kind of like puts the puzzle pieces together for you. So you want to know exactly who you're speaking to so you can actually create content for that person, right? You need to know what's actually going on in their life to some extent, not of course with every single listener personally, but why they're tuning into your podcast. What are they getting from your podcast? What are they walking away from? How are they feeling when they finish an episode or during an episode? Yeah, these are the sort of questions you should be asking yourself because it's super duper important. When you actually know exactly who you're speaking to, you know what content to create. It's no longer a writer's block, but it's more about, holy crap, I've got so many ideas. Where do I even get started? Which episode should I do next? I'm so excited. I've got like 10 ideas. And for me, when I started my podcast back in 2018, I was one of those anal people that had to have a list of like a lot before I even jumped on board to start a podcast, because I had to kind of figure out that I knew what I wanted to talk about. So I had a list of like 50 to 100 different topics and ideas for my podcast. A lot of them didn't come to fruition, but I just felt like I needed that certainty to go, yes, I have stuff to talk about. And this is the thing, some people don't even go through that. Some people start a podcast first and then figure out what to talk about. And as I said, after I shared my story, I was like, oh, okay, now I need to go back to that list because I've run out of ideas. And so something that I do now as a podcaster is I don't really get a lot of inspiration when I sit in front of a computer screen and try and think about what to say or think about what episode to create next. It happens when I'm living my life, when I'm out and about, catching up with friends, going for a drive somewhere, meeting someone, or when I'm watching an episode on TV and it sparks this idea. Or even sometimes when I listen to other people's podcasts, I'm like, ooh, that could be really relevant to my audience, but in this way, in this vantage point. Or I might have a different opinion on something, and then that helps me actually create an episode. And one thing I love to do for myself personally, and this isn't for everyone, but I have an Ask Olivia episode. So when I have people reach out to me going, hey, Liv, I've got a question about podcasting. This is what it is. I'll give them the answer straight away. And I'm like, awesome. Do you mind if I share this on my podcast? Because if you're thinking this, I can guarantee other people are thinking this too, which is exactly what happened with the episode that came out today with Day Lynn. So thank you, Day, for submitting your question all around what happens if, your audience likes your guest interview more than you as a podcast host. So I just actually, built an episode all around that. So I created content just from a question, which is great. I love to do those. And also kind of like creates more connection with other listeners that are tuning in as well, because I've seen other podcasters do this. And when they have someone, ask a question or write in or something like that, even an audio message, and they answer that on the podcast, I feel like I'm part of a community. I feel like I belong in that podcasting audience. And I'm like, oh, she's wondered that too. So have I. And now that podcast host is actually answering it in a podcast episode. And it makes you feel a little bit special too when you submit your questions and the podcast host answers them and uses your name and all that sort of stuff. It's kind of like when you watch someone do a Facebook Live and then, you've tuned in and said, hey or hi, and then they mention you live. It's kind of like a bit of a thrill, like, oh, this is so cool. And it's the same sort of feeling, when I have my Ask Olivia episode. So that's always an option for you to do that as well. But the reason why content for your podcast is so important is because it actually hooks in the attention of the listener. It helps them decide, yeah, cool, this podcast is for me. I'm going to keep binging this, or I'm going to keep showing up and listening and tuning in every week or every day or whatever, right? And the other thing too, the other side of the coin is like some content will help people go, you know what, this podcast isn't for me. This podcast host doesn't feel aligned for me. And that's okay as well. Not everyone is going to be for you. Not everyone is going to be your cup of tea. Not everyone is meant to be a part of your audience or be a loyal listener. And the sooner that we come to accept that, the easier and better it becomes for us as podcast hosts. Being holistic in your content can actually be really beneficial. So I was saying in an interview recently, actually, by this guy called Dre. So shout out to Dre. I was saying some people are very like right mind or left minded when it comes to podcasting. Some are very good with the logical, making sense of things. And then others are really good with the emotions behind things when it comes to their podcast. And what I find to be a really compelling podcast is when you've got a host that can bring the two together. The logic side of something for it to make sense, and also the emotional side of it as well. So it really connects with you as a human. Doesn't just make sense logically, but it also makes sense emotionally. You're speaking to the heart and the head. Heart, head. You're speaking to both. So that's how you can really holistically cater to your audience on your podcast as well. And that is also another reason why people keep showing up and showing up and showing up. I got interviewed for a podcast around sales the other day, and sales can be quite a dry topic, especially if it's just about processes and systems and questions and initial consults and sales calls and la-di-da. You know, when you talk about how you feel when you rock up for a sales call, or how you feel when you make a sale, or how you make others feel by actually helping and sharing, you know, your stuff with them, essentially selling to them, then, you know, that actually engages the person more, because as we know, a lot of our stuff is around mindset as opposed to just systems and methodology and strategy, right? Your content will, if your content is good, right, people will keep coming back for more. If it's informative and people learn something from you, they're more likely to keep showing up and listening to your podcast. Hi, Jenny. Thanks for joining, love. If your content makes them feel a certain way, it makes them feel good, right, or they're interested and curious about what you've got to say, then they're more likely to actually keep showing up on your podcast. Yeah. Hi, Carly. Thanks for joining, lovely. Just waving back to you, sweetheart. Yeah. So how do you make them feel? You know, how do you make them feel on your podcast? Your podcast might be about paranormal things and aliens and conspiracy theories, and it really piques people's curiosity, and they keep coming back because they've got a curious brain and they want to learn more. Or maybe your podcast is about empowerment and helping people feel liberated and, you know, feeling like they can take on the world, you know, or they can change their life. Or something like that, and they feel really inspired. Do you know what I mean? Like that right there is connecting to them emotionally, and you're helping them feel a certain way and get into a certain state emotionally, which is great as well. So can you see how just in those two examples, it has very different feels about it? Hey. What else? You also want to maximize. I've just got some notes here, guys, because I get off track. You also want to, hi, iMedia Exposure. You also want to maximize and optimize the time that you spend on your podcast. You don't want to be wasting people's time. You don't want to be like, you know, going on these massive tangents that aren't relevant to your niche or your ideal listener, or why they're actually showing up to listen to your podcast in the first place, right? Because people don't have time for that. I don't have time for that. People don't have time for that. You know, you want to optimize the time that you're spending with that listener as much as you can, right? And not to put too much pressure on yourself, of course, where it like, you know, stunts you or makes you go into like perfectionism or overwhelm. But you want to be mindful of that too, yeah? Because people aren't just rocking up to listen to your podcast because they've got nothing better to do most of the time. They're rocking up because they want something from that podcast that you're delivering. So don't waste their time. Storytelling, that's another thing. Storytelling is incredibly powerful, because when you share your own personal story or a story of someone else's that's, you know of, that's in your life, or something that's happened to you or someone you know, then what that tends to do, hey guys, is it actually creates that connection, and it actually makes people more interested in what you have to say. Hi. Because on some level, they're going to relate to your story in some way. Even if that thing hasn't actually happened to them necessarily, they might actually understand the thought process or the emotions behind whatever happened, right? So I actually listened to a podcast recently that was recently launched by my client and by a coaching friend and someone else. I can't remember now who that was. But when they shared their story, I personally felt way, way, way more connected to them in their podcast and to them as a human. So one person in particular, her Instagram account's all about motherhood and informed choice and breastfeeding and bottle feeding and, you know, nurturing your family and all of these things. It's very much children and family related. I'm a single 30-year-old woman with no kids, right? So I pop in every now and then and look at her stuff and I love it, but I can't full on relate to it because that's not my life. Hey, Susanna, thanks for joining, lovely. But I can appreciate where she's at. And then when she just launched her podcast and she shared her story around how she was unsure if she wanted kids, you know, she came out of a bad breakup, didn't know if she actually wanted to have kids or be a mother. That was when I was like, oh my God, I had no idea that this woman felt like that. And it made me feel more normal. It made me feel like I could actually relate to her so much more. Do you know what I'm saying? And then I was like, oh, I'm really curious about what else she's got to share and what else she has to say. And so then I started rocking up and listening to more of her episodes. So if that can happen for me, clearly this can happen to other people as well. The other thing too, I just want to touch on is, I know for a lot of people, they can feel quite, I guess, egotistical if they do solo episodes and share their story and talk about themselves a lot. And I just want to say, like, just touching on that subject, you know, if you're sharing your story, you're potentially helping someone, you know, and if you're helping other people share their story on your podcast, you are actually spreading a message and a story further to help more people. So it's actually not egotistical unless you're doing it all entirely for yourself. So there has to be a balance between showing up for other people. Hi, Alleyway. Thanks for joining. Lovely. How are you going? There has to be a balance between showing up for other people and helping them and serving them, and coming from that attitude of service and wanting to help and contribute. Hi. And there also has to be an element of, there has to be something in it for you as well, because otherwise you're pouring yourself, your energy and your time into a project that is just for other people. So it has to be a balance of both, a mixture. And that's how podcasting can be sustainable and long-term. Yeah. So I just wanted to cover that a little bit. The other thing too is that if you have amazing podcast content and it really connects with your audience, your soul listeners or your ideal listeners, it's more likely going to convert that person to whatever it is that you want them to do, right? Whether it be join your Facebook group, whether it be sign up to that organization or donate to this charity or start that movement or come to this face-to-face event, a networking event, or potentially buy off your website or sign up as an affiliate, right? There's so many options that's available to you when you have a podcast, right? And so when you build and you nurture that audience and you treasure them and you show up for them and you serve them and you help them and you add value, right? They're going to trust you a lot more as well. And they're going to be much more likely to actually want to carry on a relationship with you outside of the podcast, because you've built that relationship with them, you've spent the time, you've become mindful of your content, right? And then they're more likely to actually, want to continue seeing you or working with you or hearing from you. Alleyway, hello, just listening before my next work meeting. Oh, thanks for tuning in, lovely. Yeah, so even like with Alleyway, for example, I know, Ali, that you actually found me through an Instagram live with Seb Gilhouse, and then you jumped over to my Instagram and we've connected that way, which is so beautiful. So that's the thing, right? So you've got to really look after your audience, and that's why having quality content is so bloody important. And if you're sitting there and you're like, I don't know what content to actually create next, I don't know what I want to talk about, I think it's about this, but I'm not entirely sure, I don't know what my audience wants to hear, I feel like I should talk about this subject, but I'm actually not passionate about it. That happened to a client of mine recently, actually. Yep. That happened to one of my recent clients, right? So she had an investor in her podcast and it was health related, and she was doing it for herself, but also for the hospital. And because the hospital was investing in her podcast, she felt like there were certain topics that she had to talk about, but she didn't care about. It didn't light her up. She wasn't excited to talk about these subjects, but she felt like she should, or she felt like she had to. And then naturally those episodes didn't do as well, right? Because the energy behind it wasn't inspired, it wasn't passionate, it was kind of like, I've just got to do this and it's an obligation, right? And now she doesn't have that investor anymore, because she realizes that for her podcast has to really work for herself as well, not just for the hospital, if that makes sense. So that's another important thing. So these are just a few little insights on content creation, ladies and guys. I hope this has been helpful, and start the cogs working in your mind a little bit more about content creation. And it's a really great time this time of year, and especially between Christmas and New Year's, to actually get really clear about your content and getting really clear about what you want to take, with the direction you want to take your podcast, what you want to show up and talk about, what lights you up. Yeah, not just for other people, but yourself too. It's got to go both ways. Otherwise, your content's going to be a bit stifled. And this is the sort of thing I talk about in my program, Podcast Launch Queens, which goes for 8 weeks, starting in January. I talk about how to actually, create content that converts listeners. I talk about, content that actually creates intimacy and connection with your audience, which is imperative, right? That's the whole point of podcasting, right? And I share models and I share teachings and learnings, and I actually go through a systemized process of like a little template of what you can go through to go, oh, yes, I know what to create next. And by the time you leave this actual, finish the program, you know exactly how to create content that's going to be holistic and is going to convert and create that connection, which is so, so imperative. I can't highlight that enough, right? So if that interests you guys at all, feel free to reach out to me to join my Podcast Launch Queens program. Applications close on the 20th of December, but the sooner you get in, the more likely you're actually going to secure your position. As I said, this program's not for everyone. I'm only wanting to take on women and men potentially who are really serious about starting their podcast and are ready, not just fluffing around still thinking about it, but are like, okay, cool, I trust you, let's do this, let's jump in and make it happen for 2021. And if that's you and I'm speaking to your soul, then feel free to send me a message and reach out and ask any questions you've got, or share any ideas that you have as well. So yeah, I'll leave it there, guys. Thank you for watching this. I appreciate you guys as always. Alleyway, thank you. Got to run. Very interesting stuff. Oh, thank you, lovely. I'm so glad you enjoyed it, and have fun at your work meeting. All right, bye guys. See you later.